Number 10's former top advisor and the WhatsApp messages that show what Boris Johnson really thought of his health secretary. The Prime Minister sent messages calling Matt Hancock hopeless. Another one describes the handling of PPE as a disaster. This was at the start of the pandemic. Dominic Cummings was kicked out of number 10. Now his revelations have given Labour a new line of attack.
The Right Honourable Gentleman, now forever branded as hopeless Hancock by his own leader.
Are you hopeless, Mr Hancock? I don't think so.
Downing Street says the PM has full confidence in Mr Hancock. Also tonight, compulsory vaccinations for care home staff in England if they want to stay in their jobs looking after the frail and elderly. Time for a handshake, but did they agree on anything? Joe Biden meets Russia's Vladimir Putin for the first time since becoming president. From floods to heat waves, an official report says the UK is not prepared for what climate change will bring.
Pages.
Good evening. We know today that last March, at the very start of the pandemic, Boris Johnson regarded his Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, as hopeless. We know because Dominic Cummings has just published what were meant to be private WhatsApp messages between himself and the Prime Minister. It's the latest explosive intervention from Mr Cummings since he was sacked as Mr Johnson's chief advisor last November after a bitter power struggle at the heart of government. Downing Street has refused to comment on the revelations, saying instead that the Prime Minister has full confidence in Matt Hancock. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
A convenient afternoon jog.
Is this now just a vendetta, Mr Cummings and Mr Hancock?
Dominic Cummings just happened to be seen for the cameras, hours after chucking another grenade his old boss's way. He'd already been plain. In his view, the man in charge of the health system during the biggest emergency in decades wasn't up to it.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things.
But the Health Secretary retaliated. The boss had been behind him all the way.
And I had the Prime Minister's wholesome support all the way through.
Remember how close Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson were. But having promised evidence to back up his blasts from the outside, the former advisor has now published some of the messages the pair sent. In those crucial days at the start of the emergency, the advisor apparently messaged the Prime Minister, accusing the Health Secretary of failing to ramp up testing. The Prime Minister seems to have replied in expletive-filled terms. Totally hopeless. Later, Mr Cummings raised concerns about ventilators. Officials had admitted they'd been turning them down because of price markups. Boris Johnson seems to have replied, "It's Hancock. He has been hopeless." A month on, the Prime Minister, apparently in a message to Dominic Cummings, wrote, "On PPE, it's been a disaster," and seems to have suggested taking Hancock off and putting Gove on. Dominic Cummings seems to have replied, "This would have the severe risk of making it worse, not better."
Did you really think Matt Hancock was useless, sir?
Boris Johnson's team says they have full confidence in Mr Hancock. But Dominic Cummings was part of making the decisions that affected thousands of lives and deaths. Strip away the personal animosity, the huge political bust-up. And he's not the only voice critical of the government's handling, of care homes, of testing, of the speed of lockdown. And no Secretary of State wants to be asked this kind of question.
Are you hopeless, Mr Hancock? I don't think so.
Are you hopeless? I don't think so, he says. Asked about his own competence ahead of a vote on COVID today.
The Right Honourable Gentleman, now forever branded as hopeless Hancock by his own leader. Well, for many of our constituents, when they'll be watching the news tonight, when they know that they failed to protect our borders, when they know that they allowed this variant to take off, and when they saw that restrictions are being extended, I think many of our constituents will no doubt repeat the Prime Minister's expletive-laden sentiment.
Dominic Cummings knows he'd hardly win a popularity contest. But the real fear for number 10, given how close he was, what knowledge does he still guard that he can lob from far away? Laura Koonsberg, BBC News.
COVID vaccinations are to become compulsory for staff in care homes for older people in England. Announcing the plans, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said it was a sensible and reasonable step. But care organisations have warned the move could put people off taking jobs in the sector, which is already facing a recruitment crisis. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson has this report.
Ruby's that out?
82-year-old Wendy May at her care home in Scarborough. Her daughter-in-law says the home's been COVID-free throughout the pandemic and would prefer staff to be vaccinated to keep it that way.
Everybody should be vaccinated wherever possible. I think lots of people have had anxieties about being vaccinated, but if the majority of the people aren't vaccinated, we wouldn't be in the position we're in today.
It's just relax that.
The government's expected to give care home staff 16 weeks to get the vaccine or face being redeployed or losing their jobs. One care home manager told us mandatory vaccines are what she's been waiting for.
We've had 12 months of this. I've seen the sadness, I've seen the stress. And I think if we can keep people as safe as possible, then we've got to do it.
So what are vaccination rates like among care home staff working with older people? Well, across England, more than 80% have had at least one dose of the vaccine. But look in more detail and problems emerge. Around 25% are unvaccinated in cities like Manchester and Birmingham. And dig deeper, and here in the London borough of Lambeth, around 30% of care home staff still haven't had a jab. But many insist workers should have a right to choose and have described the policy as forced vaccinations. Alison Gerbo, a care worker in Lincolnshire, says she'll quit her job rather than get the jab.
It just makes me feel sick. I don't want it for my personal reasons. And I feel that we've been bullied into having it now. So I feel like after 27 years, I'm going to be made to look for something totally different.
And care organisations are warning compulsory vaccinations could cause them significant difficulties.
You can't redeploy staff in a small care home because where do you put them? Most of the staff are on the front line. It's a very difficult circular square. The government has very craftily put all the onus on the care homes.
Along with care homes, the government will now consult on whether jabs should be mandatory in the NHS, prompting questions about which other workplaces could adopt the new rules. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
The latest official figures on the pandemic show that in the past 24 hours, 9 deaths were reported and there have been just over 9,000 new infections, which means an average of 7,888 new cases per day in the last week. Over 190,000 people received a first dose of the vaccine in the latest 24-hour period, meaning over 42 million people have now had their first jab. That's nearly 80% of UK adults. The number of people who've had their second dose of the vaccine in the latest 24-hour period was 230,666. Over 30 million people have had both doses, meaning nearly 60% of UK adults are now fully vaccinated. Now, as the vaccination programme has progressed, there's been speculation about whether children aged over 12 would get the jab. The BBC understands that teenagers are unlikely to be called anytime soon, not least because all available supplies are needed for adults. Our health correspondent Catherine Burns reports.
The UK was one of the first countries in the world to start vaccinating people against coronavirus. We began with the elderly and most vulnerable and worked down through the age groups. Now it's 21 and 22-year-olds in England. Over 18s will be able to start booking theirs in the next few days. But then it stops. America started vaccinating teenagers last month. Other countries like Israel are doing it too.
COVID's probably just a ton worse than getting a vaccine.
Weeks ago, the UK regulator decided that the Pfizer vaccine is safe and effective for children older than 12. But don't expect a mass rollout for teenagers. The Joint Committee that advises the government on vaccinations isn't expected to recommend they get it anytime soon.
The absolute risk to children of death is about 1 in a million. The benefit to society is that it will reduce one aspect of transmission. It's a very difficult decision. It's one that I'm glad I'm not making.
Right now, with so-called Freedom Day being pushed back until the 19th of July, the government has a plan and doesn't want to waste a minute.
We must use this time to protect as many people as we can, as quickly as we can.
It set itself 2 targets: to get 2/3 of adults double vaccinated and to offer a first dose to everyone over 18. But is there enough supply to meet that demand?
Well, it's thought we've got a stockpile of about 5 million doses of AstraZeneca, so that should be plenty towards those second doses. There is a limit, though, on how quickly we can get through the under 40s. They're being offered Pfizer or Moderna, and there is no slack in the system there. It's believed that the UK gets deliveries of about 1.5 million doses every week and then gives them out shortly afterwards.
Which means those appointments for first doses could end up being spread out over the next few weeks. Catherine Burns, BBC News.
Government advisers say the UK is woefully unprepared to deal with global warming, which they predict will hit us harder than first thought. A report by the Independent Climate Change Committee warns of more severe heat waves, more intense rainfall and increased flood risks. Now, these maps show how the UK's maximum temperatures could change over the years up to 2080, the south bearing the brunt of the rise. Here's our science editor, David Shukman.
Can the country handle a lot more of this? Wildfires striking more often as droughts intensify. Floods hitting more homes as temperatures rise and rainfall becomes heavier. And travel disrupted by heat waves, as happened 2 years ago. The government's advisers say the UK is not ready for the impacts of climate change.
We only have to look back to last summer when we had 6 days in August when temperatures in the southeast were 10 degrees above normal. I mean, that's extraordinary, and that's impacts of climate change hitting us now in the UK. And it's going to get worse.
The most acute risk, they say, is homes overheating. In the worst cases, this can even lead to deaths. This new flat is one of many with big windows and stunning views, but temperatures that can shoot up inside. So the tenants ended up paying for air conditioning, the only option while having to work at home.
I think it's like something we haven't really considered. We're always thinking about flats that get too cold in winter, but actually there's more flats now, especially among new builds, that get too hot in summer, and on very sunny days we even had the windows open in December.
Planting more trees is one way to try to keep some homes a bit cooler, but the challenge of rising temperatures goes far beyond that. The report says that climate change is happening faster than previously thought, and that efforts to adapt to it are falling way behind. And for that, the committee blames the government. The advisers warn that the power network will be more at risk from new extremes of weather, just as all our cars are meant to go electric. And the millions of trees being planted to soak up carbon dioxide could be undermined in a hotter climate. So, how does the government respond to this? Well, no minister is available, we're told. Instead, a statement says the UK was the first major world economy to set a target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we welcome this report and will consider its recommendations closely. The advisers say the risks from climate change are escalating all the time, so they're hoping there'll now be rapid moves to make the country safer. David Shukman, BBC News.
Joe Biden and Russia's President Vladimir Putin have wrapped up some 3 hours of talks in Geneva, the first meeting between the two men since Mr. Biden entered the White House. The meeting comes at a time when relations between the two countries have been strained, to say the least. Our North America editor, John Sopel, is in Geneva for us. John, they were in a room together. Did they achieve anything?
Well, Joe Biden thinks it is good in itself to speak to another leader face to face. So that was achieved. Russian and American diplomats will resume relations after their ambassadors were recalled. But on the substantive issues, cyber, election interference, human rights, Ukraine, Vladimir Putin met the various charges with a mixture of denial and deflection.
Best wishes and goodbye. Ushparov I
And with those words, the Swiss president left them to it. There was little in the way of theatrics or fanfare, and the body language suggested a good deal of wariness on both sides, as the US and Russian presidents shook hands on the portico of this handsome 18th century villa overlooking Lake Geneva.
I'm not sure how this is working.
In the library, they sat somewhat awkwardly. A reporter asked the Russian president whether he feared the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. No comment. The American president was asked whether he trusted Vladimir Putin. He appeared to nod. He says there are a lot of issues that require the highest level of meeting. The US president concurred.
As I said outside, I think it's always better to meet face to face.
And then just shy of 4 hours after walking in, Joe Biden was walking out. The talks had not lasted as long as had been predicted. But if the talks had gone badly, President Putin was playing it down.
Both sides expressed their intention to understand each other and to seek common ground. Talks were quite constructive.
President of the United States.
Then it was the American president's turn, once the aviators had come off.
Been a long day for y'all.
He said he'd given Vladimir Putin a blunt message.
I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond. The bottom line is, I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road.
And he said he was satisfied with what had been achieved.
It was important to meet in person, so there can be no mistake about or misrepresentations about what I wanted to communicate. I did what I came to do.
This was more clear the air than new dawn. The Americans had set the bar low for this encounter, and on that basis, it met expectations. John Sopel, BBC News, Geneva.
The rate at which prices in the UK are rising is at its highest for almost 2 years. In the year to May, inflation stood at 2.1%, driven by the rising cost of fuel and clothing. It is now above the Bank of England's target of 2% and will raise questions about whether interest rates should be increased. Now, in the last hour, Wales have beaten Turkey at the delayed Euro 2020 Championship in Azerbaijan, giving them a great chance of progressing to the knockout stages of the competition. The win sparked celebrations in the stadium and across the Welsh nation. Our Wales correspondent Howard Griffiths is in Baku for us. Howard.
George, this was a real test for Wales, with 30,000 Turkish fans making this a heady, hostile environment on a hot and sticky night. But the team didn't lose their heads. In fact, they opened up the team in front of them and delivered a result to reward the few hundred fans that have followed them all the way here to Azerbaijan. Surrounded by a sea of Turkish support, the Welsh fans arrived determined not to be drowned out by the noise, and hoping that the crowd's expectation would soon weigh down their opponents.
We will blast away until the voice goes.
A little bit nervous. Obviously a must-win game for both teams.
Outnumbered maybe, but Wales outplayed Turkey in the first half.
Now can he turn? Ramsey could save.
Turkey threatened, their captain Yilmaz shooting just wide. Unity, and the hundreds celebrated in Baku. Thousands celebrated back in Wales. Turkey came back aggressively, Yilmaz threatening again. But it worked in Wales' favour. Bale brought down on the edge of the box. Penalty and a chance to seal it. Danny Ward saved them for the second game in a row. And then,
to Wales!
Just enough time for Connor Roberts to deliver some real Welsh delight. Howell Griffith, BBC News, Baku.
Live now to the fan zone in Cardiff and Thomas Morgan.
Well, even though the red wall may have been lacking a few bricks over in Baku, the fans here at home were doing their very best to try and carry some of that passion in the form of song all the way over to Azerbaijan, and it seems to have worked as Wales have got the win they so desperately needed. It's been a mammoth task for the security here in the Vale Sports Arena, keeping the fans socially distant in Wales, but nevertheless they've got the victory they so desperately needed. Well, the stars have come out in force for Wales today in Gareth Bale and Aaron Ramsey, and Cardiff has been lit up tonight. And Wales will now almost certainly be the first home nation to qualify for the knockout stages of Euro 2020 and hopefully replicate the successes they had back in 2016.
Thomas, many thanks. Now it's time for a look at the weather with Chris Fawkes. Hello, Chris.
Hi, George. Well, it's been another very warm, humid day. Temperatures peaking at 29 degrees Celsius in Greater London. But right now, the atmosphere is becoming extremely volatile with thunderstorms right on our doorstep. You might well be woken up overnight by these storms. Now, the first batch of storms I've been monitoring coming northwards from France. This area looks quite nasty. It's going to continue to work in a northeastward direction, which will take it across Sussex, right across Greater London. Well, we could see some localised surface water flooding, and that's just the first batch of storms overnight. There will be further storms anywhere really from around Dorset, Somerset, northwards and eastwards. And the amount of rain that we get from these storms is going to vary a lot, but the biggest ones could bring some localised surface water flooding. A muggy night, 18 degrees in the capital, much fresher for Scotland and Northern Ireland, where it's going to be a mostly dry night with showers slowly fading away. Now tomorrow, northern and western areas of the UK, bright sunny spells, a fresh feel to the weather just like it was today. But across the Midlands, southern and eastern England, we've got another batch of heavy, thundery downpours, again bringing the risk of some localised surface water flooding. Not as hot across eastern areas, but still quite muggy. A fresh feel for Scotland and Northern Ireland, 17 or 18 degrees Celsius here. Now a quick look at Friday's forecast. Further storms, same kind of area, and indeed we've got another batch of storms that are heading our way, becoming more widespread actually as we go through the weekend. Now with each batch of thunderstorms that come through, the very biggest of these storms could deliver 50 millimetres of rain in just a few hours, and that is enough to cause some localised surface water flooding. So that is something we're keeping a very close eye on, George.
Chris, thanks very much. And that's all for now, so it's goodbye from me and on BBC One. We can now join the BBC's news teams where you are.